It was an ordinary Tuesday morning when the peaceful neighborhood of Maple Ridge was shaken by an unexpected commotion. A neighbor, Mrs. Elaine Thompson, better known to the locals as Karen, was seen standing outside her home, hands on her hips, staring at the small stray cat lounging peacefully in the corner of her front yard. The cat, a scruffy black and white tabby, had become a regular visitor to the neighborhood. Residents had grown fond of it, feeding it, and giving it a few kind words whenever they saw it. To most, the cat was a harmless, charming part of their daily lives. But for Mrs. Thompson, it was an eyesore, something she could not stand. She was determined to get rid of the animal, convinced it was a nuisance. She began calling animal control and even posted flyers, warning neighbors that the cat was not welcome. The very idea of an animal being allowed to roam freely on her property was something Mrs. Thompson couldn't tolerate. Little did she know that her attempt to get rid of the cat would spark something much bigger than she had ever imagined. The situation escalated when Mrs. Thompson decided to take matters into her own hands. Armed with a broomstick, she marched to the cat's favorite resting spot, preparing to chase it away. Neighbors watched in disbelief as she shooed the cat, shouting that it had no place in her neighborhood. The cat, startled but unharmed, darted off into the nearby bushes, hiding from her aggressive approach. The sight of Mrs. Thompson's harsh treatment of the innocent animal sparked outrage in the community. For the first time in years, neighbors began to discuss something other than their daily routines. People started gathering, exchanging frustrated looks and words. How could one person, especially one so seemingly petty, disrupt the peace of their community? As whispers spread, some residents began to take action, questioning how far they were willing to let Mrs. Thompson go in her attempts to control something so trivial. The cat was harmless, so why was she making such a fuss about it? The first wave of rebellion was about to begin. Soon, a few brave neighbors began to form a plan. Rather than quietly ignoring Mrs. Thompson's actions, they decided to fight back, but in a way that would keep the peace. A meeting was called, and people gathered in one of the neighborhood's local parks, ready to come up with a strategy. Everyone agreed that the stray cat, which many had grown attached to, should not be treated as an enemy. But they also knew that Mrs. Thompson wasn't going to back down easily. Instead of confronting her directly, the group agreed to start showing their support for the cat in unexpected ways. They planned to make the cat's presence in the neighborhood more official, more permanent, and most importantly, loved. This wasn't going to be a petty battle. The entire neighborhood would unite to show that kindness and community spirit outweighed the anger and hostility Mrs. Thompson was trying to spread. Little did Mrs. Thompson know that her efforts to get rid of the cat would lead to a heartwarming twist that would bring everyone together, united for a cause. As the community began to unite, the first move was a subtle one. A few neighbors, inspired by the growing sentiment, decided to band together and create a safe space for the stray cat. They began setting up a small cat house in a corner of the neighborhood park, where it would be protected from the elements. They made sure it was equipped with blankets, food, and water, ensuring the cat could always return to a welcoming and safe spot whenever it needed to rest. Word quickly spread through the neighborhood, and what started as a small act of kindness became a movement. More residents joined in, not just to care for the cat, but also to show their disapproval of Mrs. Thompson's actions. The cat, once a solitary wanderer, now had a community that stood behind it. The idea of an animal being chased away simply because it didn't fit the rigid standards of one individual was no longer acceptable. The neighborhood was fighting back not just for the cat, but for the very principles of kindness, compassion, and unity. The message was clear. The cat was here to stay, and nobody, not even Mrs. Thompson, was going to change that. However, the subtle actions of the neighbors didn't go unnoticed by Mrs. Thompson. At first, she shrugged it off, thinking it was just a small gesture that would fade away. But as more and more neighbors began to show their support for the stray cat, she couldn't ignore the growing wave of defiance. Every time she walked past the little cat house in the park, she saw more and more food dishes and pet toys that weren't there before. It wasn't long before she began to feel the pressure mounting. Her attempts to rid the neighborhood of the cat were failing, and the very idea that the neighborhood was starting to view her as the villain became unbearable. She couldn't let this go on. After all, she was the one who had always prided herself on keeping everything in perfect order. She saw herself as the unofficial enforcer of rules, and this small, scruffy cat's invasion of her neighborhood felt like a personal attack. She decided to take things up a notch. Mrs. Thompson began to circulate even harsher flyers, threatening to call animal control on any resident who fed the cat or allowed it to remain. She demanded that people pick a side, either join her crusade or face the consequences. But instead of frightening the neighbors, Mrs. Thompson's aggressive stance had the opposite effect. As the days passed, more and more people joined the cause. A few of the more vocal neighbors began speaking out on social media, posting pictures of the cat with hashtags like Congress Save the Cat and Neighbors for the Cat. These posts went viral, reaching beyond the borders of Maple Ridge. It wasn't long before news outlets picked up on the story, with journalists arriving to cover the neighborhood battle over a stray cat. People from all over the city, and even the country, began offering their support. Donations flooded in to help care for the cat, and even some animal rights organizations joined the cause. What had started as a small neighborhood dispute had now become a viral sensation. Mrs. Thompson's reputation was slowly being tarnished, and instead of being seen as a protector of her property, she was now being portrayed as the antagonist in a heartwarming story of community spirit and kindness. This was no longer about a stray cat. It was about a neighborhood standing together to do what was right. The more Mrs. Thompson fought, the more the community bonded. As the days wore on, the pressure on Mrs. Thompson became unbearable. What she had initially thought would be a quick victory, evicting the stray cat and asserting her control over the neighborhood, had turned into a battle she couldn't win. The community continued to rally around the cat, organizing fundraisers, educational workshops on animal rights, and even creating an online petition to prevent Mrs. Thompson from making further attempts to harm the stray animals. The petition quickly garnered thousands of signatures from across the city, with many calling for the city council to intervene. The petitioners argued that the cat was an innocent creature, and the attempt to remove it was nothing less than an abuse of power. Every day, new signs went up around the neighborhood with slogans like "Kindness over control" and "Let the cat stay," each more creative and powerful than the last. The once peaceful and quiet streets of Maple Ridge were now a battleground of compassion versus control. To her credit, Mrs. Thompson never backed down. She doubled down on her efforts, calling in animal control officers multiple times, each time with a new complaint or accusation. She even went as far as accusing the neighborhood of harboring dangerous animals, trying to paint the entire community as irresponsible. But every time she called, nothing happened. Animal control officers visited the neighborhood only to find that there was no legal reason to remove the cat, and every time they left, the community grew stronger. They realized that they had something that Mrs. Thompson didn't: unity. The community wasn't just standing up for a stray animal. They were standing up for each other and for the values they held dear. They realized that it wasn't just the cat that needed protection. It was the spirit of kindness and unity that had brought them together. The more Mrs. Thompson fought, the more they saw the need to resist. And soon, it became clear that this battle wasn't about one cat anymore. It was about standing up to an individual who was threatening the peace and well-being of their home. In the end, Mrs. Thompson's tactics backfired in ways she couldn't have imagined. The viral support for the cat not only made her look heartless, but also turned her into a symbol of negativity in the community. Eventually, the local news stations, who had initially covered the conflict with a neutral stance, began to tilt in favor of the neighbors. Interviews with residents, who spoke about the importance of kindness and empathy, painted a stark contrast to Mrs. Thompson's rigid views. The public outcry was overwhelming, with some residents even organizing peaceful protests in front of her house, holding signs that read, "No to cruelty, yes to compassion." As public opinion shifted in favor of the cat and the neighborhood's efforts, Mrs. Thompson found herself isolated and vilified. The situation had escalated beyond her control, and it was clear that she was losing the war of public perception. The cat, who was once just a symbol of a stray animal trying to find shelter, had become a hero of sorts. It was now a mascot for everything that was good in the neighborhood, and no one was going to let it be removed. The turning point came when the community decided to hold a final meeting with Mrs. Thompson, hoping to resolve the conflict peacefully. The meeting was arranged at the local community center, and the air was thick with anticipation. People from every corner of the neighborhood gathered, many of them with their children, pets, and even their elderly parents, all united under one cause: to protect the stray cat. Mrs. Thompson, ever determined, arrived at the meeting with a sense of confidence, ready to assert her dominance. She stood at the front of the room trying to command attention, but as she looked around, she quickly realized she was outnumbered. The room was filled with the voices of not just a few vocal residents, but an overwhelming majority, all speaking in favor of the cat. People shared stories of how the cat had brought comfort to their children, how it had been a source of joy for the elderly, and how it had simply become a part of the neighborhood's fabric. The more they spoke, the more Mrs. Thompson's face reddened. She had underestimated the bond the cat had formed with everyone, and it became clear that this was not just about her personal grievances. It was about a community standing together to defend what they believed was right. Mrs. Thompson tried to make her case, but the crowd's energy was unstoppable. One by one, neighbors spoke out, explaining how the cat was harmless and how they had come together to take care of it, even offering food, medical care, and shelter. A few of the residents had even taken it upon themselves to create a little sanctuary for the cat in a secluded part of the neighborhood, complete with a cozy shelter and food bowls that were refilled daily. They had gone above and beyond to ensure the cat's safety, and they were not going to let anyone, not even Mrs. Thompson, take that away from them. The realization that they had not just helped a stray animal, but had created a community that was stronger, kinder, and more united, filled everyone with pride. They weren't just defending the cat anymore, they were defending their collective values, standing up against a force that sought to tear apart the very foundation of the neighborhood's sense of community. As Mrs. Thompson continued to argue, the crowd only grew more resolute. It was clear no one was going to back down. And just when it seemed that Mrs. Thompson might try one last attempt to call in the authorities or seek further legal action, the unexpected happened. A local lawyer, who happened to live in the neighborhood, stood up. He offered his services pro bono, willing to help the community navigate the legal complexities that might arise should Mrs. Thompson continue her crusade. He explained that there were laws in place protecting animals in the community, especially those that were being cared for by the residents. He also pointed out that any attempt to evict or harm the cat would likely be met with legal resistance, and the community would fight back. The presence of legal support gave the residents even more confidence, and it sealed Mrs. Thompson's fate. She realized that her battle was lost, not only because of the overwhelming support for the cat, but also because she now faced a community that was willing to stand up against her, legally and morally. The crowd erupted in applause, and in that moment, Mrs. Thompson's last hope of winning the fight evaporated. The cat, once an innocent bystander in this conflict, had now become a symbol of triumph for the entire neighborhood, and no one was willing to let go of it. In the end, Mrs. Thompson had no choice but to accept defeat, and the stray cat remained a beloved part of the neighborhood, a symbol of unity and compassion. The residents had not only saved the cat, but had also discovered the true power of community support and solidarity. As for Mrs. Thompson, the once feared neighborhood Karen became an example of how sometimes the fight for what's right doesn't need to be won by force but by the collective strength of a community coming together. The neighborhood learned that kindness, respect for all living beings, and a sense of togetherness could overcome even the toughest opposition. To all the viewers out there, remember that standing up for what's right, even when the odds are against you, can bring people together and lead to remarkable victories. Never underestimate the power of community.